is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Russia sets out its conditions for ending military action against Ukraine as a third round of talks begins.
Our other headlines: Ukraine rejects Moscow's offer of humanitarian corridors to Russia and Belarus, calling them completely immoral.
And oil prices hit a 14-year high. The stock market seesaw as the United States and Europe discuss a ban on Russian oil.
A third round of talks is now underway in Belarus, aimed at breaking the stalemate over the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For the first time, Russia has set out its demands.
They include a change to Ukraine's constitution to ensure neutrality, acknowledgement of Crimea as Russian territory, and recognition of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent. Meanwhile, heavy Russian shelling of civilian areas continues, with Ukrainians fleeing the violence. Well, so far, the majority have made it to neighbouring Poland, where our correspondent Ryan Thompson is standing by. Ryan, good to see you. Let's start with the talks. The first two rounds didn't get anywhere, but this time Putin set out his demands.
Yeah, the first two times were really a non-starter. The progress was basic. The first time they agreed to talk again, and the second time they agreed to have these humanitarian aid corridors. But as we've seen, the success of those aid corridors has been very little because the two sides keep blaming each other for breaking the ceasefire that is necessary in order to get civilians out and aid in. In fact, we actually haven't even been able to really talk about bringing aid in, that key food and medicine supplies, because the people haven't been able to get out. We saw the Ukrainian delegation arriving about, just over 2.5 hours ago, and one of their representatives put a video on Facebook where he basically laid out everything we knew before about how these talks would go over in Belarus. But one key detail that he added was him, like the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, they would like to be talking. They don't want this to be on the ground in terms of warfare. They say this is the 21st century. It is time for diplomacy and dialogue, not for warfare on the ground. Of course, the Russians not really seeming likely to let up just yet. They are fully engaged in their combat at the moment. It is likely to be a difficult path forward as these two sides remain very, very far apart.
Ryan, there's a lot of activity going on behind you. You're on the Polish border. So what is the latest on the refugee situation?
Yeah, Juliet, just over 8 p.m. last night, the Polish border guard informed us that the millionth displaced person had arrived here in Poland from Ukraine. We are about 20 kilometers from the border, but the key point here is that this is where a lot of the trains arriving from Lviv, Odessa, even Kyiv are stopping here. So those people, women, children, elderly, fleeing for their lives, trying to escape the shelling and the bombing at home are arriving here, and this is their first point of refuge. You can see lots of activity, lots of suitcases, people fleeing with just a bag on their back and shoes on their feet, very few possessions. They arrive here, they are taken in by Polish authorities who basically give them the status they need to figure out what will happen over the next few months. And then after getting a hot meal and some sense of direction, they're able to move on, take a train or a bus to the next step. But it is a complicated situation with numbers expected to rise. 1.6 million so far, according to the United Nations, and we expect it to top 2 million in just a day or two's time. Estimates really expect that this is going to be one of the fastest growing refugee situations in Europe, with the most amount of people arriving in the Union that we've ever seen so far, Juliet.
A lot to take in. Ryan Thompson in Poland, thank you.
Well, China's foreign minister has called for calm, stressing that this dispute must be settled through diplomacy.
During a press conference in Beijing, Wang Yi also spoke about the importance of China's relationship with Russia, but emphasized again that it was not an alliance.
中国和俄罗斯，我们都是联合国安理会的常任理事国。 The relationship between China and Russia is one of the most critical bilateral relationships in the world. Our cooperation is not only beneficial for both peoples, but also benefits world peace, stability and development. I would like to emphasize that the China-Russia relationship is not based on alliances, confrontation or targeting of a third party, and that it's free from interference.
We cannot stop importing Russian oil and gas overnight. That's the message from the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, hosting his counterparts from Canada and the Netherlands in London. The Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, and Canadian leader Justin Trudeau have joined Johnson at Downing Street at a press conference, and our correspondent Andrew Wilson has been watching events for us. Andrew, this is a highly visible meeting of Western leaders. What have they been saying?
Well, it's another chance for the West to show off its unity. Justin Trudeau travelling over from Canada to London last night. He's on his way later on to Latvia, where he'll meet the leaders of the 3 Baltic states there, and then Poland, and then off for talks with Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany. Anthony Blinken's already been in Eastern Europe as well in the last couple of days, I think also going through Germany. There's a whirlwind tour of Western leaders, all apparently singing from the same hymn sheet and all pledging to do what they can to push back this invasion that's taking place in Ukraine. The problem is what came clear at this press conference today with Mark Rutte there and also Justin Trudeau and Boris Johnson is that the options are becoming limited. The sanctions are bigger and more severe than anything we've ever seen before in modern history. Really everything that the combined economies of the Western world can do to damage the Russian economy is being done. There's a massive refugee operation underway. Clearly a lot of weapons and other kinds of supplies, military supplies and food and other kinds of support are making their way across the borders into Ukraine to try and help with the resistance effort there, and yet the violence only gets worse. And what was clear at the press conference today is journalists are starting to ask the Western leaders, what can you do now? And it's clear behind the scenes the Western leaders are asking each other the same things. What can we do now? Because the sacrosanct line in the sand has been drawn. We do not want to get involved in direct conflict with the Russian forces. That means no no-fly zone. Even these plans to put US planes in Poland to allow Poland to give its Russian-made jets to the Ukrainian Air Force, there's concerns that that might be considered by the Kremlin to be direct action against Russian forces. So there is a limit being reached where NATO has to reanalyse perhaps its questions of commitment, and that became clear. Clear also on this issue of oil and gas as well. The Americans may be able to switch off any dependence on Russian oil and gas because they don't really use it anyway. But for Europe, it's a different question, particularly Italy and Germany, but other states as well. These things take time, said the Russian Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. We can't just turn off the taps of Russian energy overnight. We need that flow until we can make adjustments, and that could take months, even years.
Andrew, one of the things the UK can do on Russia is tighten the economic sanctions screw on the Kremlin. The economic crime bill is being rushed into the UK statute books in the House of Commons much sooner than expected. What more can you tell us?
Well, you know, much has been made of this idea of London being a haven for money laundering, and it's something that's gathering steam in terms of world opinion as well. We're getting a reputation in the UK for being a safe haven for ill-gotten gains from different individuals from around the world, Russia and others as well, but particularly Russia. It's thought that billions of dollars of property and other assets are now owned by unidentified super-rich Russians in the UK, and that's because the properties and other assets are owned by offshore companies with opaque management structures where no one can tell exactly who is the immediate beneficiary of the assets or indeed the profits those assets might make as well. That's something that the government's had pressure on it to do something about since about 2014, and slowly but surely this economic crime bill has been born into being. It was going to take a little longer to come to the statute books, but it looks like it's going to be rushed through now, cracking down on ownership from abroad, cracking down on foreign companies with opaque management structures owning properties in the UK. There'll now be a register drawn up where all these properties have to be linked to an individual. The individual has to be declared itself. It will become an offence for that not to happen. And also the strengthening of what are called UWOs, unemployed wealth orders, where investigations can be made into large amounts of money if it's not clear where that money was made or what the source of that money is. Again, a direct attempt to try and prevent some of this laundering practice that's known to have gone on in the UK for quite some time. But whether this passes into law or not, the real crucial key key is whether the crime agencies will get the support and funding to be able to staff these investigations and go after these billions of dollars that are held in the UK. That's another question altogether.
Andrew, thanks for that. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson.
Well, away from the diplomacy, the refugee crisis is building. Temporary shelters are springing up across Ukraine as millions of people flee towns and cities under bombardment from Russian forces.
The mayor of Lviv in western Ukraine says the city has reached the limits of its capacity to help people displaced by Russia's assault. Our correspondent Nawid Jabarkal is in Lviv and sent us this report.
This stage was built for performers. It's now part of a national war effort. Makeshift humanitarian centres like this concert hall in western Ukraine have sprung up nationwide. Sorting through the chaos are volunteers like Mila.
We're getting supplies from all over Europe, not only Ukraine, but a lot of countries are sending their stuff like medical supplies, dry food, clothes, a lot of things. Here we sort everything in lists and then we provide further to Kiev, Kharkiv, to smaller villages all around Ukraine, to Bila Tserkva, to Cherkasy, to Chernihiv, just you name it.
All across Ukraine, centres like this are working around the clock. This war has already led to the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. And with a lot of the state's efforts focused on fighting Russian advances, it's places like this that are proving essential for hundreds of thousands of displaced people.
Outside, the demand's easy to see. The city of Lviv has become a hub for those fleeing for safety. Among the crowd, one woman stands out. Clutching her baby, Elena looks pensive, the trauma of recent days evident in her gaze. So many here are still trying to make sense of a war they never wanted.
Мы приехали как беженцы из города Харькова.
We came as refugees from Kharkiv because our city is almost completely destroyed due to heavy shelling. My baby is 6 months old and we came here to get a pram. We don't have a pram, we don't have any clothes. We have no idea what to do next.
Thanks to people, we can get some food. And now we are waiting in the line to get some necessary things for babies because we took just our document, passport, a few things to eat, and just were escaped.
It could happen to anybody.
It is terrible. It is terrible because you are peaceful, you are in your home, and one day everything just has changed in 1 minute. Without no reason, we didn't anything. Just you're losing everything in one moment. It's very scary.
In less than 2 weeks of war, the UN says more than 1.5 million people have now left Ukraine. The speed of this exodus means many are simply trying to survive, day by day, relying on handouts and any help they can get. Nawid Jabarkal, CGTN, Lviv.
While the talks between Russia and Ukraine continue, Russian shelling is still preventing the evacuation of civilians from besieged cities, according to Ukrainian officials. Mykola Balaban is from the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security in Ukraine.
We desperately need the no-fly zone under Ukraine from the NATO, from the Western world, and from I think all civilized country, because Russia, as we presume, the next step of Russia, because they understand that now they couldn't defeat Ukrainian army in the field like in this blitzkrieg manner, but they will try to do something very similar that was happened in Aleppo in 2015, or generally in Syria. So they will try to terror the Ukrainian population with the heavy bombing.
You talk about strategy and how there should be, in your view, a no-fly zone. But what about reinforcements? What about things like the basics: food, water, power? How is it where you are?
By so far, all this supply, Ukrainian society and state, I think it's the whole society respond, and the huge amount of volunteers and also governmental institutions, they right now they provide all necessary basic needs for those people, for Ukrainian cities, especially those that are on the zone, the frontline zone.
You talk about volunteers, you talk about aid, and there's these humanitarian corridors that are being suggested to be set up. Will your family and friends leave the country?
No, definitely I'm not. But I think it's very good option for people, for Ukrainian women with children, especially with the young children, and also in Ukraine among my colleagues, active veterans of Russian-Ukrainian war from 2014. They have like one vision that we need to go to send to safety our children and our wives, and come back to fight the invasion.
Now, as we've been hearing from our correspondents in the field, the third round of talks between Ukraine and Russia are taking place in Belarus. Where would you put your expectations? High, low, somewhere in between?
I think low, because Ukraine, my expectation is quite low, because actually since 2014 there was a lot of different peace processes and like conversations, but all the time this conversations is ending with ultimatums. So the open position of Ukrainian government here is absolutely clear that we want peace, we want negotiations. But every time, with every round of this negotiations, at the end, nothing is happening. Because I think our listeners and viewers have to understand that actually it's like Russian army now, they are fighting in Ukraine. So, and they are moving their troops and all actions that they are doing is like in Ukraine. So they, in any time, they can stop the moving forward, for example, and this armistice could be started, but they do not stop. And even during the negotiations, all active military measures. So the full scale war is ongoing. So that's why I'm like, unfortunately, I'm quite pessimistic here. But there is always room for hope.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, oil prices soar to $139 a barrel, the highest for 14 years. The global shockwave from the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Let's get more for you now on Ukraine and the confusion and argument over those humanitarian corridors, which would allow, if they worked, civilians to flee the fighting. The Associated Press reporter Philip Crowther is in Lviv in western Ukraine. Philip, welcome. Moscow says it will allow refugees to flee to Russia and Belarus. The refugees, it appears, want to go west, not east. What's the latest you can tell us on these humanitarian corridor plans?
Well, we don't know yet how many refugees or would-be refugees have actually taken up that offer from Russia, because this is a unilateral decision taken by Russia to open up these humanitarian corridors that would be accompanied by ceasefires in all of those areas to get people out. It is unlikely that people would have gone in these directions, because who would want to go toward the country that is currently attacking you? That is the case of all of these cities where Russia says it has organized humanitarian corridors toward Belarus from the capital Kiev. Of course, Belarus, one of those places from which Russia staged its attacks along with its very own borders with Ukraine. Also an offer out of Kharkiv toward Russia in the north, and also from Mariupol in the southeast toward Russian-occupied areas in the east of the country. So these would all be refugees moving away from attacks from Russia, sustained attacks and bombings of their civilian areas, of civilians themselves, toward the countries from where those attacks were staged. That is why this offer has been roundly criticized by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, for example, calling it amoral, and the French President Emmanuel Macron saying it would be hypocrisy. Now, the reason why he had to speak out about this is because he'd had a call with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin shortly before that announcement from Russia, but what Russia did announce was absolutely not what France had asked for.
Can you tell us any more on the planned ceasefire in Mariupol to the south?
Well, it was planned, and it simply did not work out, and that's because Russia did not respect that ceasefire agreement. This is something that had been agreed upon by Ukraine and Russia together, not once, but twice. Yesterday, first of all, rather yesterday and the day before, both times, those proposed ceasefires were broken by Russia because it fired on civilians who were actually trying to get out of Mariupol. So those humanitarian corridors never came to be, despite their urgent necessity, because in Mariupol there are around 200,000 people that are reported to want to get out because they have been under siege since this Russian invasion began. It's now the 12th day of this invasion. So a lot of people would want to get out and move westwards. We are a long way from there, but this is a place where refugees undoubtedly would want to get to. And there's also a dire need for humanitarian aid, for food, for medicine to get in. But none of that happened either yesterday or the day before. And from what we're seeing today, and from those talks that might still be ongoing between Russia and Ukraine, we don't have that confirmation right now. There might still be an offer to further ceasefires, but we don't know that just yet.
And where you are, what of the refugees? We know that the numbers are rising, not least in Lviv.
Yeah, 1.7 million people have already fled Ukraine, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. That is an enormous amount of people. And there are many who pass through this city of Lviv. It is a peaceful city right now within a country that is at war. This is a country that has not been bombed by Russia yet. There's always that fear, of course, that this military campaign from Vladimir Putin might be extended, that this invasion might go all the way to the west of the country as well. Not the case right now. This is essentially a safe haven. So what we see here in Lviv are a lot of refugees coming from the east, from the center, from the worst hit cities all across Ukraine, and this is essentially a place where they can transfer and maybe even take a bit of a breather after very, very difficult, treacherous journeys that they have been on from bombed out cities right now. So from here, their transport goes on to, for example, Poland, where most of the refugees have been arriving, but also to other neighboring countries like Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia.
Philip, thank you for that. Philip Crowther from Associated Press in Western Ukraine.
Oil prices have hit their highest level since 2008, after the United States says it was in talks with European allies over a ban on imports of Russian oil. US markets opened down, with the Dow falling 0.4%. Things are changing fast. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. John, I mean, when I saw $139 a barrel, my eyes nearly popped out of my head.
Well, how do you think I felt? It was Sunday night, relaxing, looking at the screen. Couldn't believe it, and nor could anybody else here. We were all deeply shocked. We haven't seen $130 a barrel since about 2008. So what's that, 14, 13 years now, something like that? And it all came about after Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, who's on a tour of Europe at the moment, he's presently in the Baltic states and will be there until tomorrow, Tuesday, said over the weekend that the US is actively considering banning the importation of Russian oil. Now, the US currently imports about 3% of basic crude, but if you add in all the things that go with crude oil that they also import, it brings it to 8 or 10%, which is quite a lot. The drive for this banning of Russian oil is coming from the Congress rather than the White House. We've heard this morning from a representative based in Texas called Kevin Brady, who says there will be a bipartisan bill on the table by the day's end in Washington that will frame the banning of Russian oil importation and also ending the normalization of the trade relationship between Washington and Moscow, and also Minsk, which is the capital of Belarus, which I thought was interesting. President Biden and the White House team under immense pressure at the moment. You told me in the last program that he's been meeting with President Macron of France, Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom, and Chancellor Scholz of Germany. The issue of the oil ban is, I suspect, top of the agenda. Chancellor Scholz of Germany tweeting within the last couple of hours he's not too keen on the notion of an oil ban, so we'll see how that plays out. And here in America, the White House has sent officials to Venezuela to try and look at getting oil out of Venezuela, which is remarkable when you look at all the bad blood that has passed between them these last couple of years. There's talk of a Saudi Arabia trip in which the president will basically hand out the begging bowl to the Saudis, trying to get them to increase the spigot. And there's even talk of Iran exporting oil and gas again. Not quite sure what the terms of that deal would be. Financial Times International Edition reporting the West is looking at doing just this. What we don't know is whether America is going to go this alone. At the moment, it does seem to be that way, based on what Chancellor Scholz was tweeting within the last couple of hours. And so you end up with $130 per barrel. It's down now, but it's still bad, 117. US petrol stations around New York increased their prices twice over the weekend, which is pretty unheard of. And we now have a new nationwide average of $4.06. And tomorrow, Tuesday, we'll hit a new all-time high of $4.11. All very inflationary, Juliet.
But John, the financial markets don't seem to be able to make up their mind. They're all over the place. Certainly, if you look at London, you look at European stocks.
Well, I know. Well, they have been for months now, haven't they? Of course, coming to the end of the COVID era, dealing with interest rates and inflation and all that kind of stuff. And now this 10 or 11-day-old war. I mean, what can I tell you? The Dow's down 1.1%, 390 points. NASDAQ taking a big hit again, 219 points, 1.6%. S&P 500 down 60, 1.3%. Money is going into gold. It's coming out of Bitcoin. It's going into bonds. The yields saw their biggest drop last week on record. So yields are down, prices are up as everybody wants in. Wheat has doubled in the last 2 weeks. And here's an interesting thing for you. Now, this will make you smile. Elon Musk has just tweeted. He said, I hate to say it, but it's time to increase oil and gas production, which, when you think about who Elon Musk is, that is a remarkable tweet. He also says it's time to fire up the dormant nuclear power stations in Europe and get them going again. Apparently, there's 120 of them. Getting a nuclear power station up and running again and providing electricity is reasonably easy to do. So we'll see. Finally, here in America, it's inflation that is the dominant issue for the president and for the people. The U.S. can't really ramp up its oil production any more than it already has, and some of the commodities coming in from Russia can't be replicated. I mean, wheat can, sort of, but you can't really with crude oil. There's only 3% electric cars in America. All the car makers that do electric vehicles, including Tesla, their share prices are up right now, not down. But it's a big problem for Joe Biden, who faces crucial congressional elections in November, and inflation is the #1 issue for the voters.
And November will be around sooner than we think, won't it? I mean, I'm now starting to wonder where Elon Musk is putting all of his cryptocurrency. Anyway, John, in New York, thank you very much.
So global oil and gas prices continuing to soar amid talk of Western countries banning Russian energy imports. There are growing fears of an impending worldwide economic shock. Let's talk to James Waddle, a senior global gas analyst with the consultancy group Energy Aspects. James, welcome. I don't know if you managed to hear the Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking in the last hour or so. I mean, he said quite simply that a Russian oil and gas ban simply couldn't happen overnight. The West has been reported as saying that the Western countries have been considering a Russian energy ban. It's simply not possible, is it?
Well, we've gone into this military crisis, political crisis, on the back of an already pretty extreme energy crisis in Europe, where gas prices have already been at multi-year highs, in fact, way above previous highs that have been recorded. And that has translated into both gas prices for industry and also power prices for industry and for homes. So we are very reliant on Russian energy, Russian crude, Russian diesel, and especially Russian gas. And replacing that is extremely difficult, given how already tight the global system is and how already tight the European system is.
So what are the alternatives to Russian gas and oil?
Well, put simply, on the supply side, we are very much lacking in alternatives. Now, on crude, we're already in a very tight global crude market, and these efforts to increase crude production are being made. The thing with crude, it is more flexible in terms of transportation. So if you can get the funding in there within about 6 to 12 to maybe a year and a half, you can start to meaningfully increase that production. The trouble with gas is that we are locked into a pipeline with Russia. If you want to get new gas supply globally, you have to build new LNG terminals, and that takes about 3 to 4 years. So we are very much constrained on the supply side for global gas.
I mean, there has been huge criticism within Europe and from the United States about Europe becoming too dependent on Russian gas. It really is too late now to have a backup plan in place, isn't it? And as you say, this takes ages.
It does take ages. What we are now looking at in terms of options is how do we cut the demand? Now, price signals are already saying to industry, don't produce as much as you've been trying to produce. And we're seeing some form of gas demand destruction occurring. But this is what we're having to do to balance the market, because the supply side just isn't there. And we've had since 2014 and that first invasion in eastern Ukraine to get our act together and to move away from Russian supply, and that just hasn't really happened.
So Western countries will continue to pay Russia enormous sums every day for gas and oil, bankrolling their invasion of Ukraine. That's it simply, isn't it?
It's a very unfortunate situation, but that is the reality of what we have to face over the coming months.
James, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. That's James Waddle, the senior global gas analyst with the consultancy group Energy Aspects.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, assurances from US Secretary of State Antony Blinken on his Baltics tour that Lithuania and Latvia will have NATO protection.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just gotta be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Russia sets out its conditions for ending military action against Ukraine as a third round of talks gets underway.
Ukraine rejects Moscow's offer of humanitarian corridors to Russia and Belarus, calling them completely immoral.
And as we've been reporting, oil prices hit a 14-year high and stock markets plunge as the United States and Europe discuss a ban on Russian oil.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has assured Lithuania and Latvia of NATO protection and American support on his visit to Baltic state as Russia continues its invasion of Ukraine. His Latvian counterpart asked for a permanent NATO presence in his country, which borders both Russia and Belarus. Well, our correspondent Ollie Barrett is in the Latvian capital, Riga. Ollie, thanks for joining us. What was said at the joint news briefing earlier?
Well, Antony Blinken used the press conference with his Latvian counterpart to really make it clear, repeat the US position that it's very strongly backing the NATO principle that if there were to be an incursion into a NATO member country, then other NATO states would come to its defence. He's made it very clear that he sees the Baltic nations in this region as very important, not just as part of NATO, but because of what he calls a wall of democracy with what he says is Russian aggression on the other side. So very much a show of solidarity with these Baltic countries, further show of solidarity for NATO as well. Antony Blinken making this Baltic leg of his European tour one of the key elements of it.
He's also, while he's in Riga, meeting the Israeli foreign minister, and then he's heading to Estonia as well after that to France to meet President Macron. I mean, what more do we know about these diplomatic efforts?
Yeah, it is a busy few days. Even here in Latvia, Antony Blinken also catching up with the Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, who is here for talks with Latvian officials as well. Antony Blinken saying he wants to compare notes with the Israeli Foreign Minister about Israel's attempts to mediate between Russia and the West. You mentioned Estonia as well. The diplomacy is continuing apace here, and you were discussing earlier that idea of cutting off Russian oil and gas exports to large chunks of the world. Well, Antony Blinken said here in Latvia that he absolutely believes that that is a very real possibility, something that the US is exploring. Antony Blinken coming here, as I say, to show NATO solidarity and support for these Baltic nations, but also to show that diplomacy can have an effect. And during his press conference here in Latvia and in Lithuania earlier in the day, he was asked repeatedly about whether this diplomacy, whether the sanctions are actually having any effect on the behaviour of Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin at the moment. He insisted that actually these sanctions are having an effect on the Russian economy and can make a difference, but he will be able to use some of the rest of his European tour to continue to mine that argument and try and make the case that actually further sanctions could make an impact as well. And he made that clear too here in Latvia, as did the Latvian Foreign Minister, that further sanctions are very likely indeed against Russia.
Ollie Barrett reporting from Riga. Thank you.
The EU's foreign policy chief has warned that the number of migrants fleeing the violence in Ukraine could rise above 5 million.
Joseph Borrell was speaking ahead of an EU ministerial meeting in France as Moldova became the first of Ukraine's border states to call for extra funding to deal with the growing influx of refugees.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Linda Kennedy in Brussels. Linda, this is a pretty stark warning from Borrell, isn't it?
It is, and the big question is, do others agree with him? And pretty much yes is the answer to that. Perhaps he is one of the only politicians that is putting that specific figure on it, but other countries are bracing for significant, substantial waves. But it wasn't just the number of people leaving Ukraine that Borrell was talking about today, it was also the name, what to call them. Let's have a listen.
There are already 1.5 million refugees in a week, and if the bombardments continue, if cities keep being indiscriminately targeted, we can expect 5 million. Not migrants, we cannot call them migrants. They are exiled people, people trying to escape the war. So there will be a major problem on the eastern border of Europe, and we must do everything we can, not just humanitarian aid.
Linda, Moldova saying it's going to need a lot of extra money soon. Any idea how member states could respond?
The European Commission has announced new humanitarian aid for people in Ukraine and also in Moldova, and that money is going to be going towards water and shelter and food. But Moldova, of course, is not an EU member. It put in an application last week, along with Georgia and shortly after Ukraine, to become a member of the EU. But that process is, of course, a very long one. To even get candidate status will take a while. Then there has to be unanimity amongst current members before official membership negotiations can start. And Moldova is in a very difficult position, a neighbouring country to Ukraine, a very small, poor European country, already accepted tens of thousands of refugees and very much needful of that help that was announced by the European Commission and hopeful of more.
Linda, there's been a fair amount of criticism over how some countries are processing or not processing visa applications.
Yep, and that criticism is quite squarely being pointed towards Britain at the moment, because there was that news that they had just 50 visas to the name in terms of the Ukrainian family scheme. Boris Johnson this afternoon was questioning that figure from the Home Office, his own Home Office, saying, well, I don't think that's right, but he wouldn't be drawn on any specificity as to how there might be more visas granted. He, when he was meeting his Canadian and his Dutch counterparts, would only say that there will be a very, very generous scheme, but that people wouldn't want in Britain to have a system by which there was no checks. But also this afternoon there was a particular category of refugee, or as Morel was saying, we have to call them exiled people, that should be getting special consideration, and that is unaccompanied children. The UNHCR saying this afternoon that there are many unaccompanied children who have been separated from their parents, and they are particularly vulnerable, and they should be very much protected, and people who are prioritised for admission to other countries.
OK, Linda, thank you for that. Linda Kennedy, our correspondent in Brussels.
A truck has been deliberately reversed into the gates of the Russian embassy in Dublin. Eyewitnesses say the driver then got out of the truck and handed out photos, which he said were of victims of the conflict in Ukraine. Irish police say a man has been arrested over suspected criminal damage.
Now, one of the key features of the war in Ukraine we've seen is how effectively Ukraine has mobilised its population.
Russian attacks have been met with fierce resistance from both the military and civilians. Well, CGTN's Duncan Hooper has been monitoring social media. Look, Duncan, we've seen many join up to the military or irregular forces. But what about those who aren't carrying weapons? You know, how are they contributing to the war effort?
Yeah, Julia, one of the tragedies of war perennially has been that civilians get so often caught up on the front line, and you know, you hardly see that until you see the dead bodies that have perhaps been captured by a foreign press reporter. Now, that's still happening in this conflict. We saw the New York Times today publishing a very dramatic photograph of a family hit by shelling next to the suitcase in which they packed their possessions as they tried to flee. But Ukrainian citizens are also trying to take a much more proactive approach to intervening and influencing the outcome of this conflict. And they're doing that thanks to social media. One thing they've been doing is exploiting the quite close cultural links which exist between the Ukrainians and the Russian soldiers that are opposing them. We've seen, for instance, a Ukrainian grandma haranguing Russian troops on the street. We've seen villages facing off against tanks. And there was this video that we saw last week, which showed a crowd of people opposing Russian soldiers trying to block a road to stop those forces getting to their strategic objective, which is a power station. We also saw in the city of Kherson, which has been taken by the Russians, big demonstrations in the streets. And while these don't really change facts on the ground, they can be very important in winning over public opinion, especially internationally. But it's not just about trying to gain friends and win positive influence, it's also about demoralising the enemy. And one thing we saw there that really illustrated that was the Russian Interior Ministry. An advisor last week came out and said he wanted to unblock the VK network, which Ukraine has blocked because they said it was spreading Russian propaganda. He said he wanted to unblock that to allow Ukrainians to share photos of destroyed Russian vehicles, captured troops, so that the people in Russia would be able to see that they were not being successful in that combat.
Now, you mentioned VK, and that's one of the last social media available in Russia after TikTok stopped accepting new content in Russia. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, it seems like TikTok's really jumped before it's been pushed, because while it does have a slight difference to the other major social media channels, which got blocked last week, Twitter, Facebook, because it's not based in Silicon Valley, it has pursued many of the same policies, and the Russians were warning that they were thinking about blocking it. But there are two particular issues which TikTok has faced in this conflict, and they're kind of quite new to it. One is TikTok's very easy to monetize, so it will incentivize people by paying them a share of the advertising revenue it gets. If they get a lot of video views, it will also allow them to accept virtual gifts from their audience and then convert that into cash. And so that incentivizes people to post things that are going to get a lot of traction, a lot of views, a lot of likes and shares, but not necessarily things that are true. So we saw a video purporting to show Russian paratroopers jumping into the conflict zone that in fact was from 2015 in a military exercise. We saw very emotive scenes of soldiers saying goodbye to their wives. Turns out it was from a war film. So that's one of the issues TikTok has. The other one is just the speed of its growth. So last year it became the most visited website on the internet, ahead of Google, ahead of Facebook, Amazon. And it has, I think, 5 million videos uploaded every hour, 1,000 every second. So while it says it's expanding its moderation team, it says, look, we're going to get a grip on this, we're going to block things, we're going to ban them. At that scale, you can see it's going to be almost impossible.
Duncan, thank you very much for that. Keep watching. We'll come back to you in coming days, I'm sure. Duncan Hooper.
Well, let's get more now on what China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been saying in the light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
He's been speaking during a press conference in Beijing on the sidelines of China's annual political meetings. Our correspondent Li Juanhua reports.
Every year at the political season, the press conference with Chinese Foreign Minister is considered a highlight. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi took nearly 30 questions from reporters. Wang answered questions about China's foreign policy and diplomatic relations. And we have to say this is one of the very rare opportunities that reporters from around the world get to ask the Foreign Minister questions about China's stance on international issues. And this time, unsurprisingly, questions related to the Ukraine crisis were the most asked. The first 5 questions were about China's stance on the current situation. And about the Ukraine crisis, Wang said China hopes the third round of talks can bring progress. Rationality is needed now to find a solution to the current crisis, and China proposes initiatives to avoid humanitarian crisis. China-U.S. relations were brought up for sure. Wang said the U.S. needs to put verbal assurances into practice, and the major country competition is not the right choice. And both sides should work to push China-U.S. relations onto the right trajectory. And of course, China-Europe relations were touched upon. Trade volumes reached $800 billion in 2021. The number of freight trains commuting between Europe and China stood at 15,000 last year, and China sees Europe as a very important trade partner. On Taiwan issue in particular, Wang pointed out that the Taiwan question differs in nature from Ukraine issue, and the scheme to use Taiwan to contain China is doomed to fail. On global governance, Wang said developing countries now will participate more in global governance, and Asia's time has come. Given that many international meetings will be held in Asia this year, there are also some other issues about China's relations with ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, Central Asia, India, South Pacific nations, Africa and Latin America. All in all, we can see that China would like to shoulder more responsibilities when it comes to global governance, maintaining world stability and safeguarding global economic recovery. Li Jianhua, CGTN, Beijing.
In some other news from around the world, the first stretch of a high-speed railway connecting Serbia's 2 biggest cities will open in mid-March, according to Serbian officials.
The 75-kilometre stretch is part of a much bigger project to connect Belgrade to Hungary's Budapest. CGTN's Alyosha Milenkovic reports.
Ahead of the railway's official opening on March 15th, heavy machines make some finishing touches to this train station. Trains already run on these freshly laid tracks. Although at the moment, those are just the trial runs of the German Railways test train, which is needed for the railway's EU certification. And of course, the new train's drivers are familiarizing themselves with the new tracks. After the official opening ceremony, these new trains will travel 75 kilometers from Belgrade to Novi Sad in 35 minutes. This is just a small stretch of railway in Serbia. Overall, it won't make a dramatic change to the country's infrastructure. Yet it is significant because it is the first step, the successful beginning of a large project which would make Serbia a modern 21st century transportation hub within Southeast Europe. Serbia's goal is to have this type of high-speed railway stretching from the country's southern to the northern border with the EU.
Right after this is finished, we'll start with the construction of the next stretch, which will be finished by 2024. The Hungarians should finish their 153 kilometres around the same time. After that, we'll have a Belgrade to Budapest railway, with journeys taking 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Together with Russian railways, China Railway International and China Communications Construction Company played a crucial role in constructing this part of the railway. China's loans mainly financed the entire high-speed railway from Belgrade to the Hungarian border.
I'm very happy because of the very successful collaboration we have with the People's Republic of China. We're always grateful to our friend Xi Jinping for everything he's done for Serbia, and because the Chinese companies are very reliable partners for our country.
Serbia is one of the leaders in Southeast Europe with its infrastructure projects, building hundreds of kilometers of new highways, railways and new airports. Many of those projects are happening with help from China. Serbia hopes that all of these can help the country maintain its status as the most important transportation hub of this part of Europe. Aljoša Milenković, CGTN, Belgrade.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. The electric odyssey for motorsports fans. Extreme E-Rally driving the world to a green destination.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tense here. Bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just gotta be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Extreme electric rally motorsport fuses science, adrenaline and high-end engineering. It's also a form of motor racing that claims to be going green.
Our correspondent Guy Henderson went to an event in Dorset in England described as an electric odyssey.
The quaint rural landscapes of Purbeck are about to be in for a shock. Descending around this fragile ecosystem, a motorsport with a mission.
I've come to Dorset in southwest England to take a look at a race series that's pushing electric vehicles to new limits while highlighting the threat of climate change.
It's called Extreme E, and over the course of the past year or so, it's torn through the dunes of Alula in Saudi Arabia, ripped past Senegal's under threat Lac Rose. We've come to the final race of the season near the UK's ancient Jurassic coast. Bovington's usually used as a training ground for the British Army. This week, it's allowing a rather different crowd on site. The championship cars are a one-design fleet, fully electric SUV named Odyssey 21.
On the steering wheel itself, they have just 4 buttons for wipers, radio, pit limb, and also the hyperdrive, which is a bit more exciting. It gives them a boost of power that they can use once a lap to try to overtake more easily.
So that is a hydrogen fuel cell system. So we start here, we make electricity from solar.
Electrical energy is then passed through water using electrolyzer technology. That creates hydrogen gas. When it's needed, the hydrogen is then pumped into fuel stacks alongside oxygen using an electrochemical process. It's then converted into electrical energy.
The battery then stores the electrical power and the cars just charge up off the batteries. So all of the race vehicles are charged on site by clean power.
Were there points in the tour where you looked at some of the tracks and thought, this is going to be a real challenge for the vehicle?
Oh yeah, every time.
Really?
In this championship, every time.
Wow.
Because the cars are not like exactly developed for the terrain, I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously it's the first year, so they're just doing.
So it's an experiment to find out what works.
Each team has 2 drivers, 1 male and 1 female, and the race events are held over 2 days.
You hear other things, like normally in the car you're like, bah, 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 that. In this one you're like, zzz, zzz. I feel that yes, of course, with the electric we know that we can do 4 laps and then we have to stop and charge and we have to wait it to cool down. But apart from that, the car is built the same way or even better. It's way more technological, developed than my car.
We're standing here on Studland Dunes, which is the easternmost point of the Purbeck Heaths National Nature Reserve.
What is it about this place that's so unique?
So what's really special about it, you're on the edge of the most biodiverse bit of the whole of the UK here.
So why on earth would you want to host this huge international car racing competition on this delicate land?
To be honest, it's one of the mistakes nature conservation has made in the past is trying to think, well, nature over there, people over there, and it doesn't work because people, we've got to have nature with people, but also if you disconnect people from nature, we'll never find a solution to this. We have to find ways to reconnect people, and what I think is exciting about the Extreme E event is it opens up a completely different audience to us.
Over the course of the weekend, the Extreme E finals and Year 1's home finale pulled in viewing figures of 16 million across 195 countries, continuing to attract a fast-growing audience for this environmentally conscious motorsport.
They didn't let him behind the wheel, though, did they?
No, they didn't.
Guy Henderson reporting there on Extreme E-Rally Sports.
The headlines again. Russia has set out its conditions for ending military action against Ukraine during the latest talks between the 2 sides. Negotiators have just said that they'll meet again for further discussions in Turkey on Thursday.
Ukraine has rejected Moscow's offer of humanitarian corridors to Russia and Belarus, calling them completely immoral.
And oil prices have hit a 14-year high and stock markets plunge as the United States and Europe discuss a ban on Russian oil.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.